In April of the year 2000, brothers Juan and Pedro Sanchez, while drilling in the Nica mine in north-central Mexico, discovered the giant crystal cave, which contains the world's largest known formations of selenite crystals. Although the world's deepest cave was discovered by Russian speleologists in the Caucasus Mountains in 1968, its deepest point wasn't reached until 2017. It is 2,212 meters deep, which is slightly over 7 Eiffel Towers or 2.5 Burj Khalifas deep. If this century could reveal unbelievable cave discoveries, what other secrets is the Earth hiding? After I first stumbled upon and became obsessed with the story of Hell's Chimney, I couldn't believe that it wasn't at least as well known as something like Devil's Tower, which is a little more than 50 miles west of it. It's not even as well known as South Dakota's Wind Caves, which is about 70 miles southeast. But the more research I did on Hell's Chimney, the more I came to see how weird and problematic the story is, and why there's so little information about it. So here's what we know. On July 20th, 1926, a highway construction crew was extending Highway 85, roughly 46.1 miles north of Spearfish, South Dakota. According to the official incident report of H. Thomas Miller, that day's foreman, at roughly 11:30 a.m., a loud noise was heard above the sounds of the bulldozer engines and leveling crew working at the north end of the project. Survivors later reported thinking it was the noise of a backfire of a bulldozer engine. Another described believing it as some kind of gunfire. After an additional deafening crack, a cloud of dust erupted and the ground gave way in a massive sinkhole beneath most of the crew, swallowing a bulldozer and its operator, 3 construction crewmen, and various equipment totaling $55,000. In a year-long court case, in which the insurance company resisted paying the full amount due to the unusual nature of the incident, eventually a plea deal with the families of the victims was reached for an undisclosed amount. The highway was rerouted to the northeast through Redig, South Dakota, which is where it remains to this day. Miller died of complications stemming from alcohol poisoning a few years later, and the 2 other surviving crewmen weren't identified in legal documents. The court documentation doesn't tell much, but it does say that none of the bodies or equipment were recovered, and reading between the lines, it doesn't seem like an attempt was ever seriously considered, for reasons we will see later. After its discovery in 1926, geologists from the United States Geological Survey were sent to catalog and study the sinkhole. The initial diameter of the roughly circular sinkhole was reported as approximately 48 feet at the rim, though later studies contradict that, with the 1977 census putting the diameter of the rim at roughly 39 feet. Attempts during the 1926 study to determine the depth of the hole were complicated by lack of equipment, as the initial rope, flares, and other tools needed to establish an exact depth were insufficient. This earliest study determined that the depth was more than 830 feet, the combined length of all their rope. Unexpectedly, the end of the rope was completely dry when they pulled it up. Attempts to determine the depth through sound, by listening for objects to hit the bottom, were complicated by the noise of the hole, which made a constant whistling due to its shape, hence its initial name as the Growling Hole or the Growling Pit. The team noted that the eerie whistling seemed to grow louder at night, forcing the team to relocate their camp because they were having trouble sleeping because of the noise. Visual evidence of the pit's depth was also unsuccessful, as the flares dropped into the hole were no longer visible after falling for approximately 6.5 seconds, indicating that a layer of haze obscured the view of the flares. Brighter flares and more sensitive audio equipment was brought in subsequent years, but were similarly unsuccessful in determining the true depth of the hole. Side note, I think of that scene from the old Journey to the Center of the Earth film, where they drop a torch into the pit and it takes forever to drop out of sight. The location of the hole near the Black Hills geologic complex indicates that it was formed about the same time, roughly 65 million years ago. There appeared to be a vigorous debate amongst geologists about the pit's formation. Some argued that the increased stiffness in the walls, its depth, and its near-perfect verticality indicates it was formed as a volcanic shaft, though others counter that it was formed through an extreme form of erosion or some less understood geologic mechanism. Personally, I don't see any way that it wasn't formed through some kind of erosion. The pit, as it's described, is too perfectly vertical to have formed through geology, pushing some structure so perfectly vertical. Doubts about the stability of the rock near the edges and the vertical nature of the shaft walls meant that any attempt to scale the walls would need to be attempted by an expert climber. The team had initially scheduled 2 more days for their study, but ended up leaving early, partially due to reports of nausea, giddiness, and vertigo experienced near the pit. A second expedition arrived in March of 1928, determined that the hole was 955 feet deep, though later teams would discover that this was a false reading, either due to the weight on the end of the rope getting caught on the walls, some outcropping, or some undetermined obstruction. Plans were made with mining engineer consultants from the nearby Homestake gold mine to construct a winch system at a stable outcropping on the northeast edge to enable longer cables and the ability to lower down a volunteer for visual investigation. Terence Fisher, a pseudo-professional rock climbing consultant who arrived on the 3rd day of the expedition, determined that although the rim of the hole wasn't completely stable, there was a reasonably stable entry point into the hole near the northeast edge. However, he was unwilling to make an attempt, as the walls appeared irregular, the gusty winds unsafe, with too poor lighting to be scaled safely. Though more experienced climbers were consulted in the coming decades, it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that any serious attempts were made via climbing. Construction of the elevator system was complete in late 1935. An early design was nearly complete years earlier, but out of an abundance of caution, it was decided to replace the rope system with stronger steel-woven cables and a 2-point anchoring system. Dr. Jeremy Abbott, a long-term USGS geologist involved with the 1926 and 1928 expeditions, volunteered to conduct the in-person investigation in the winch elevator. Side note, this guy. This is where things start to get crazy, and a lot of what I found about what would come later had to do with this Dr. Abbott guy. I would hold him responsible as one of the main reasons why there's so much skepticism and so many questions about Hell's Chimney to this day. On March 23rd, Dr. Abbott was lowered into the hole. During his 3-hour, 27-minute expedition, he took meticulous notes, mapping the rock formations, the shape of the shaft, and temperature/wind conditions. After reaching the haze layer between the 600 and 700 foot level, Dr. Abbott reported glitches in the lighting system. He lit a torch and continued past 1,000 feet, though he reported visibility as severely limited. I could scarcely see my hand in front of my face. He lowered rope to determine that the pit was at least 1,260 feet deep, but the conditions, increasing swaying and collisions with the walls, forced his ascent. The damage to the elevator was significant enough to require a significant rethink of the design. The team was also indecisive about the future plans because Dr. Abbott returned significantly rattled. According to the team, he reported that while at the 1,000-foot level, he could see stars through the haze at the opening of the pit, The walls were vibrating whenever he wasn't looking directly at them, and there was a faint reddish glowing emanating from below. After his return to the surface, he didn't leave his tent for the remainder of the expedition. Like the previous expeditions, the 1932 expedition ended multiple days early, with the participants seemingly frustrated, disheartened, and puzzled about how to proceed. Reading between the lines, it seemed like the expedition was shocked at Dr. Abbott's going a bit crazy and disturbed by their findings and proximity to the pit. The next few decades saw a significant decrease in the official study of the Growling Pit, for three main reasons. Firstly, about a year after the previously mentioned USGS expedition, the United States entered the Second World War, and governmental priorities and financing shifted away from domestic projects like this. Secondly, the lack of progress with Growling Pit studies and the escalating costs were disheartening for officials. The proposed changes for the winch elevator system, installing a third cable on the less stable southwest edge to stabilize the winch elevator at lower depths, cost more than they were interested in funding. Lastly, Dr. Abbott's ongoing erratic behavior negatively impacted the respectability of the project. Shortly after returning to give a report of the third expedition, Dr. Abbott returned to South Dakota on his own time and money to continue his studies of the Growling Pit, but his work was at odds with his geologist colleagues. They would describe his theories as borderline paranoid, unsupported and unsupportable, and even irrational and erratic. Among his theories were that the Growling Pit was actually a portal to some other world or dimension, which had beings who he could communicate with at night when no one else was around. That the dust or fog obscurity at the 600 to 700 foot level was either hallucinogenic or was sentient. That the laws of gravity were inconsistent and that the Growling Pit was formed through some kind of potent acid dripping vertically from a source lower down. The passion and disconnectedness with which Abbott pursued these theories put him at odds with others in the field, to the point where pursuing additional studies in the Growling Pit would have had negative reputational repercussions for any scientists involved. Additionally, Abbott was a near constant presence at the pit, chasing off any visitors or curious townfolk. It was during this time period that the name shifted from Growling Pit to Hell's Chimney. So this video is getting way too long. As much as I would love to tell you about the subsequent drama around the pit, Abbott, one Terence Fisher, and the cult of the pit in the 60s and 70s, the pit casino construction fiasco in the early 80s, or the subsequent lack of details and claims that the pit opening somehow shrunk in diameter until it gradually resealed itself, I think I'm going to have to call it here. The current status of Hell's Chimney is shockingly difficult to nail down. Given how precise the location was in early materials, it's unbelievably puzzling that there isn't more documentation since the 70s. Either there was some kind of undocumented geological mechanism that built up rock material at the top of the pit and sealing it, making it unfindable, or probably more likely, this whole thing was some kind of fabrication. It's deeply frustrating because there are so many compelling details about it, yet there are also some things that strike me as impossible to believe. I'll let you make up your own mind. We here at Classy Hippo Studios would like to thank those most perceptive members of our audience who can reliably identify a fabrication nestled in accurate contextualizing research as a form of faux historical entertainment to glamorize the mystery of nature and the appeal of the bottomless pit story. To those of our audience who are still quite intelligent and attractive, but who thought this video was accurate, legal tells me I have to inform you that, outside of the introduction and certain contextualizing facts, the story of Hell's Chimney is 100% and completely made up. Thank you for understanding.